Preet Bharara served as U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York from 2009 till 2017. The New York Times has called him one of the nation's most aggressive and outspoken prosecutors of public corruption and Wall Street crime. Bharara supervised the litigation of all criminal and civil cases and oversaw an office of more than 200 assistant U.S. attorneys, handling cases involving issues such as terrorism, narcotics, and arms trafficking, gang violence, organized crime, public corruption, and civil rights violations. During his tenure, his office also prosecuted nearly 100 Wall Street executives and closed multi-billion-dollar hedge funds for activities including insider trading. Since 2017, Bharara has been a distinguished scholar in residence at NYU School of Law, served as a senior legal analyst on CNN, and hosted Stay Tuned with Preet, a popular podcast focused on issues of criminal justice and fairness. Serving his third term as King County Executive, Dow Constantine leads one of the largest regional governments in the United States. As a leader, his priority is that every person be able to thrive, be economically secure, and contribute to the life of our community. He is focused on meeting two of the greatest generational challenges of our time, building equity and opportunity and confronting climate change. And guiding every initiative is the goal of becoming the most forward-looking, best-run government in the nation. Seattle native and fourth-generation Washingtonian, Dow served in the State House from 96 to 2000. And then when Greg Nichols was inaugurated as mayor in 2002, Dow was appointed to the King County Council, where he won election to office 4 times. They're here before becoming the county executive in, I believe it was 2009. Fortunately, there isn't a quiz, but he'll correct me when I leave the stage. They're here tonight to talk about many things, including Preet's latest book, Doing Justice, A Prosecutor's Thoughts on Crime, Punishment, and the Rule of Law. Please join me in welcoming Dow Constantine and Preet Bharara.
Thanks, Bill. Thank you. Well, good evening, everyone I know. Good heavens. This is a remarkable crowd tonight, and so many familiar faces. We're thrilled to be here tonight with Preet Bharara. Shall I call it? It's former U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, Preet.
Correct. Yes.
Is that what I should call you?
Just call me Preet.
Oh, Preet. Okay.
One name works.
All right. They've had a lovely fundraising event downstairs, a full house upstairs. We're excited to get started. I just wanted, for those who have not followed your career, if you could just give us a little bit of background to start. Tell us your origin story and how you decided and when you decided to become an attorney.
First, thank you for doing this. Thank you for coming. Can I begin out of order?
You can do
because
whatever you
people
want.
Are very polite. People are very polite when they introduce me, and they say, and Bharara left office in 2017. I was fired by the President of the United States. and now I'm a private citizen, so when I come up on stage, I drink red wine. Which my handlers told me not to do when I was in office. His handlers clearly tell him something different. Look, so you know, a part of why I became a lawyer, having been, immigrant. I was born in India to a Indian American doctor who wanted desperately for his 2 sons. One of them was me. To become doctors was that I was not good at chemistry or science generally, so I had to pick another acceptable profession. Engineering also did not work out for me. Which if there are any Indian Americans out here, you know what I'm talking about. Oh, in the back. Really? Look, one day you can sit up here. Oh, hey. I didn't, but to the left.
Yeah.
It's still not like center orchestra. So growing up, I read things that some people read, and I took a great liking to them. I read Inherit the Wind, and I remember thinking, that's an amazing thing to be able to argue about stuff and persuade people about things. And then To Kill a Mockingbird, I know it sounds kind of almost quaint. That show's on Broadway now in New York. It'll probably be touring around all sorts of places, including Seattle. I took my kids to go see it. So this idea that I was an argumentative kid, and I thought, if you can become a lawyer, you can argue your cause. And that kind of was thrilling to me. Not more difficult or complicated than that.
I just watched a lot of Perry Mason. That was pretty much it. That's how I became a lawyer. Early in your book, you make this statement, your book, Doing Justice. You say that your overarching goal as U.S. Attorney, for those in your charge as well, was to do the right thing the right way for the right reasons.
Yeah.
How has that mantra, those beliefs, guided your actions as a lawyer and in your life?
So, that was not, I didn't develop that phraseology. Mm-hmm. I make clear in the book, places have cultures. Universities have cultures, sports teams have cultures, banks have cultures, prosecutors' offices have cultures, and the culture of the SDNY that's become much more, I guess, notorious, famous now because they keep arresting people close to the president.
I told you when we're backstage.
This is the easiest crowd ever. I really love me some Seattle. It's all that coffee, probably. But I was hired by Mary Jo White, one of the great prosecutors in modern times, who served in office for 9 years. And that's what she said, that your only job in this place, it's not to win, it's not to get convictions, it's not to send people to prison. And people don't fully realize this about prosecutors who I think are right-minded and who act in good faith. The job is to do the right thing in the right way for the right reasons. And all three of those things are important, right? Because you can do the right thing for the wrong reasons, because you're ambitious. Or you can do the right thing in the wrong way, because you think the right outcome is something and you cut a corner. So all three components of the right thing in the right way for the right reasons are incredibly important. And I think that's what should guide everyone in public service, not just in prosecutors' offices. It should guide people in the State Department. It should guide people in the Defense Department. It should guide people everywhere. The problem is, it's a simple mantra to state, but that's one of the reasons I wrote the book. In particular circumstances, it's not always clear. Often it is. They're easy cases. But often it's the case that you have to think a little bit harder and reason a little bit more carefully to figure out what the right thing to do is.
That is related to one of the real central themes of your book, this book, which is about...
You can hold it up.
Yes. You should all have one of these. Which is about the search for the truth. Yeah. And about the existence of some objective reality that we need to try to get to in a legal case or in society more broadly. Now, people are attacking the media, attacking the very idea that facts matter and that there's an objective truth. What can we do to restore the notion that there is objective reality, the facts matter, yeah, and then we need to honestly pursue the truth?
So that's a really good question.
We only have half an hour.
I'll take 41 minutes with this one. Now, look, one of the problems with what's going on now with the president and the people around him is it's utterly exhausting. I mean, I can't keep straight which lie is my favorite and most appalling lie. And you can lose a little bit of focus on this stuff. And I agree with the people who say you just need to maintain your sort of North Star about what's true and what's not true. And when people transgress, you have to call it out. That's not just on the part of private citizens like me. It's on the part of the media. It's on the part of good public servants in the White House or otherwise, who have not done it as much as they might otherwise do. I just think you have to be patient and you have to be diligent about calling out things. And it can get tiresome and exhausting when thing after thing after thing happens. I also think, by the way, one sort of practice point on outrage is you do have to pick your spots because it can get exhausting. I remember one time I got a lot of grief in my Twitter feed. You should follow me, Preet Bharara. You can find it easily. It was like a year and a half ago. The President of the United States said something. I think he said something about the White House itself. The White House was like I forget what he said. Something terrible about the White House. I was going to say he said it was a shithole, but that's how he described countries with people. A dump. He called the White House a dump. I can't even keep it straight. And I posted a tweet, and I thought this is not the thing to be outraged about because there's so many other things. And I said this is not in the top 50. This is not in the list of the top 50 things to be outraged about. And I thought that was a pretty non-controversial statement. And then the responses in my Twitter feed were like, "Don't tell me what to be outraged about." And people wrote, "I can multitask in my outrage." And these were all people who liked me.
Yes.
I don't know if that was an answer to your question, but I think
Entertaining. So, returning to this idea about the search for the truth, your book is full of great stories. One might call them war stories from your time as prosecutor. And there's a really interesting case in your book involving sort of bias and subjectivity on an issue that seems very cut and dried, which is the analysis of fingerprints.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit about that one?
Yeah, so part of what I wanted to do was sort of present situations to people so they could think, how would I react if I was presented with these facts, right? So it's not a book for lawyers. I mean, lawyers, I think, hopefully will enjoy it. But it's a book about thinking and about moral reasoning and about decision-making. And we exalt science. And we think, well, you have DNA, that must be it. Or you have a fingerprint match, well, that's the end of the story. And sometimes that's not true, right, as you know as a lawyer. And there was a case that I was not involved in, I was almost involved in, involving an act of terrorism on March 11th of 2004, where there was a terrorist attack on trains in Madrid, Spain. You may remember it. 191 people were killed, the most significant terrorist attack in the world since 9/11 in Europe, and the most, I think, significant terrorist attack on the European continent since the World War II. And everyone obviously is scrambling to figure out who did it. And the Spanish National Police find at some point a plastic bag with detonators inside, close to the crime scene, I think in a van, and they try to lift fingerprints from the plastic bag. And they find a few, none of them match anyone. They send it to the greatest law enforcement organization, they say, in the world, the FBI. And the FBI finds a match. So the first fingerprint examiner at the FBI, expert, finds a match to person X, nothing known about person X, no identity, it's just in the database. Another FBI examiner confirms it, a third FBI examiner confirms it. And when they finally look at the identity of the person who's involved in this act, which they thought was perpetrated by jihadist terrorists, it's a reasonable assumption, it comes back to a white young lawyer named Brandon Mayfield, not far from here, in Portland, Oregon. And they're scratching their heads, like, what's this white dude named Brandon Mayfield doing involved in this terrorist attack in Spain? And they might have scratched their heads further, but for other revelations that came forward very quickly. They found, Brandon Mayfield actually converted to Islam. Brandon Mayfield actually married an Egyptian woman who was Muslim. And Brandon Mayfield also, in his civil law practice, represented somebody who had been accused of being a part of Al-Qaeda in a a child custody matter, not in the criminal matter. And that caused, I think arguably, people to be like, oh, it seemed weird, but oh, now it makes sense. It matches some narrative that we think made sense. He must be a closet, terrorist, jihadist guy, even though his name is Brandon Mayfield. And I don't want to spend the whole time talking about the case, but it turns out that they were dead wrong. They tried to investigate further. They could find no connectivity between Brandon Mayfield and Spain at all. They couldn't find any connectivity between him and terrorism in any way, shape, or form. And then at some point, when they were worried that their investigation was going to become known, and they had FISA warrants and were doing searches of the home, they took him into custody, the FBI in Oregon. Didn't charge him, because they didn't have enough to charge him, but under something called a material witness warrant, they took him into custody, and they kept him under 23 out of 24 hours a day lockdown. And then at some point, the Spanish National Police, who had never, by the way, agreed with the fingerprint analysis of the FBI, found a match to another guy named Daoud. Makes more sense. And because of that, the FBI realized their error, and they did a thing that they never do, and I love and respect the FBI. I worked with them my whole career. They apologized, and they paid him $2 million. But the point of the story is, in the movies and on television, we spend a lot of time talking about the horrible, racist, bad actor who plants the gun and who is wholly incompetent. And you realize that, injustice is not always done in those circumstances. Here, there is no evidence that the original fingerprint examiners were anti-Muslim or biased or bigoted in any way. They didn't even know who it was. But once they made the analysis, by being not perfect in how they did their job, by not adhering to best practices, the later information confirmed their bias, and they didn't alter their decision-making. And that can cause as much of a miscarriage of justice as anything else, and we focus on that less, and we shouldn't.
The confirmation bias lesson from that legal case, you can see in operation in our political life in this country every day. It's fascinating that even a fourth expert was brought in to look at the fingerprints, and it's right there.
Hired by the defense. Lest you think the FBI is terrible, I'm glad you brought that up. The lawyer for Brandon Mayfield got the court to appoint an independent fingerprint examiner, and it turned out that fingerprint examiner said, oh yeah, it's totally that guy.
And it's like black and white, the fingerprints, there's a detail that doesn't match, can't be the same.
But just to complicate it more, there were not 3 incompetent FBI people and 1 incompetent defense lawyer guy. It turns out that crazy coincidences happen in the world. Oh, hey guys. I didn't see you over there. That crazy coincidences happen in the world. It turns out that Daoud's fingerprints and Brandon Mayfield's fingerprints are really, really similar. They're just not identical, right? So people didn't do as perfect a job as they might have done. It wasn't like they were ridiculous. It was close. So people have to be as perfect as they possibly can, particularly when lives are at stake.
So we've already established that you were fired.
Yes, we have.
But Jeff Sessions, who I'm honored to say has sent me several threatening letters over the years, Jeff Sessions Jeff Sessions offered you and 45 of your colleagues across the country the opportunity to resign, and you alone chose not to and were fired instead. Why?
Because I'm a diva. No, there's a bit of a backstory. So President Trump I'll do it really fast. I'll do it faster. I'll be like a pharmaceutical ad. So Donald Trump gets elected. I didn't expect it. I thought I was going to leave. He calls Senator Schumer, for whom I used to work. Senator Schumer says, Donald Trump wants you to stay. He's impressed with your work. I said, okay, great. I'm asked to meet with Donald Trump, the president-elect, at Trump Tower on the Wednesday after Thanksgiving in 2016. I go and meet with him. He's late because he's reading the presidential national security briefing for the first time ever. And I'm entertained by, at the time, Jared Kushner.
I mean, it seems entertaining.
And Steve Bannon. You guys are so predictable. And it's like, and then the President-elect comes in, and he asked me to all the stuff, and he's very lovely, and he asked me to stay. He also asked me for my phone numbers. If you listen to the first episode of my podcast, this is all explained in great detail, but the shorthand version of it is, I think he was trying to cultivate me. I'm the only U.S. attorney who was appointed by Obama or not appointed by Obama that Donald Trump decided to personally meet with, shake hands with, ask to stay on based on presumably the quality of the work and the reputation of the office. He called me a couple of times, which is very odd and weird, and I thought inappropriate. Didn't say anything inappropriate. Then he called me on March 9th of 2017. That was a Thursday. I decided, based on consultations with my office, that not knowing what it was about, was he going to ask me about a case, was he going to ask me to do something inappropriate. This is, by the way, before I knew about the fact that he said lots of inappropriate things later, including to Jim Comey about loyalty oath and laying off on Michael Flynn and everything else. I thought, until I know what it was about, I shouldn't speak to him. And I did a thing that I'm sure, pissed him off, given that I was only there at his pleasure. I called back and said, it's not appropriate for me to talk to the president unless I know what it's about. And then, as you say, 22 hours later, I was asked to resign. And I didn't at first because when I got the call from the functionary at the Department of Justice, I thought, are you sure that applies to me? Because I had this whole thing in the Trump Tower, and I loved the job, and I thought, and he didn't do that with anybody else. I'm like, it's going to be embarrassing. Like, hey, why'd you resign your job? I did it by accident. I didn't know that it. Because that would have been awkward. And then they couldn't explain whether or not I was covered or not covered. And the press would call the Justice Department and said, does this include Preet? And they would say, we don't know, call the White House. And they called the White House, and the White House said, call the Justice Department. And then I decided, I just would like to know the facts. And if I had been an ordinary U.S. attorney that had never had any contact with the president, I would have left. I wasn't trying to be difficult. But I wanted for posterity to know the person who not only asked me to stay, but invited me to his office, shook my hand, asked me to stay, implored me to stay, by the way. I know Donald Trump likes to say that everyone came to him and begged for their job like a dog. I assure you, I did not beg for my job like a dog. And so it took a day, and once I understood that the person who had asked me to stay wanted me to go, I left.
So the firings continued today. I mean, we shouldn't be surprised. He made his reputation as a reality television star by saying, "You're fired." So the firings continued today. What are your reflections on today's activities?
So do people follow the news today? Because I love Seattle. You're like all like walking C-SPAN in your ear. So look, I'll borrow a phrase that I heard David Axelrod use on television. It's appalling but not surprising. I think that's like the best way to describe it. And Donald Trump has a habit of doing the most brazen, self-serving and antagonistic thing immediately after he's gotten away with something. Right? I mean, look, the whole impeachment thing happened when? Like, it went on for a long time, but, the sort of epicenter of the impeachment inquiry involved a July 25th call to the president of Ukraine. What happened on July 24th? Bob Mueller testified. It's like an interactive, it's great. Welcome, class. Class participation counts for 25%. So he does the whole thing the day after because he's emboldened. And look what happened, as you point out, what happened this week. He was acquitted on a Wednesday. He could have fired Lieutenant Colonel Vindman and Ambassador Sondland and others, that all of that happened today before, but he, his people told him probably to wait until vindication in his mind. And I think he's going to go on a complete and total rampage and set of retaliatory acts, some of which may be illegal or not, I don't know. But we shouldn't be surprised by it, but we should be angered by it. But, I'm a little bit at a loss. I don't have a great thing to say about it, because I think good and decent and honest, good faith people, including Adam Schiff and others, undertook their constitutional obligation, brought articles of impeachment, went to the trial. They were stymied with respect to witnesses, and then the end result was what people expected. And then now Donald Trump is utterly emboldened to do what he wants. I don't have an optimistic message about today, sorry.
One of the, your book, as it says right on the cover, is a New York Times bestseller, very
yes,
popular.
Yes, it is. Say that louder.
Yes. But one of the mild criticisms I heard, probably mostly from people in this room, is
softer.
that you did not spend enough time talking about what a bad person Donald Trump is in your book. Why did you make that choice?
Because I prefer to do that live. So people have different platforms, right? So I'm on Twitter, I am on CNN, I have a podcast you should listen to. Stay tuned with Preet. And I wrote a book, and there's different purposes for different things. And I say things about Donald Trump on Twitter and occasionally on television, but I thought if I'm going to sit down and write a 100,000-word book, I want to be more serious than that. I want to be more sort of long-lasting than that. And I also think that when people try to make an argument at some length and with some substance through storytelling and argument and otherwise, the minute you invoke Trump, and there's plenty of books that are against Trump, and I could have written one of those, trust me. The minute you do that, though, a lot of people tune out. And I wanted to write a book about fundamental things, like how you find truth, how you make tough decisions. And as I say in the intro, obviously, the book is born of these things that are happening now. And, the sort of things that the people around the president say, alternative facts, and truth is not truth, and a bad way of discussing things, and the sort of deterioration of the quality of debate. But as I say in the intro, sometimes the best way to address current events and current issues is to go back to first principles. And that's what I wanted this to be about. I don't talk about Trump in the same way that other events happen sometimes that are astonishing to me, and you'll know what I'm talking about. People will go to John McCain's funeral, for example, and Donald Trump's name will not be mentioned. And yet there will be a eulogist who will talk about decency and compassion and principle, and people will say, "Why are you attacking the president?" That tells you something about the president. So it's a little bit like that. I'm talking about decency and principle and truth and justice in a way that does not mention him almost ever, but hopefully that's in the front of your mind as you read.
So I don't want to lose the opportunity to ask you about the last chapter of the book. You spent a lot of time in this book talking about how the law is important, but it can only take us so far, and that ultimately it is about people, it's about human beings and their goodness. And your last chapter is called Beyond Justice, and it contains a really startling, riveting story of humans transcending their circumstances. Could you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah. So the point of the book, which may seem odd coming from a lawyer, is that the law is actually weak, and the law has a lot of limits. And you don't get justice only from laws and statutes. We always say, and it's a correct statement, right, and from law school, that we are a nation of laws, not men. And we say that all the time, and there's good reason for that. But that is not the end of the story, because you can have a perfectly written set of rules, statutes, regulations, a constitution, but unless the people are good, you're not going to get justice. I mean, to those of you who think, we don't have justice now and we have the rule of law under attack. The Constitution hasn't changed. Most of the criminal statutes have not changed. Very few regulations have changed. What's changed are the people and the attitude about the enforcement of that law. And I quote from Clarence Darrow at the start of the book, famed criminal defense lawyer, who says, every human being's life is inevitably mixed with every other life. And no matter what laws we pass, no matter what precautions we take, unless the people we meet are kindly and decent and human and liberty-loving, there is no liberty. Freedom comes from human beings rather than from laws and institutions. And I believe that. But it's also true that there are things that the law can't do. Can I just borrow that for 1 second?
You're going to give it back.
I will give it back. I sign this. But I want people to understand that if you want like a good society and you want cosmic justice and you want people to get along better, the law is not your answer. And so I began this chapter, the final chapter, as follows. You will not find God or grace in legal concepts, in formal notions of criminal justice. Certain values and ideals are beyond justice. These include mercy, forgiveness, redemption, dignity, also love. And then I told a story about a man who was a victim of a crime soon after 9/11. And we all remember 9/11 in a particular way. I lived in New York. I was in the U.S. Attorney's Office. Ground zero was yards from my office. And know people who perished in the towers. But the other thing that people don't maybe remember as much was that was an opportunity for some folks to engage in all manner of hate crimes against people who frankly look like me. And they thought, shouldn't be in America. And I tell the story of one particular person, a gentleman named Reyes Bouillon, who was a victim, among other victims, of a person named Mark Anthony Stroman, who in Texas decided a couple of days after 9/11 that his job was to kill Arabs because of what happened in 9/11. And he went into various places, including a gas station and a bodega, and he killed a couple of people. But the chapter is focused on someone who he shot at point-blank range in the face, but did not kill. And his name is Reyes Bouillon, who was a Bangladeshi immigrant, Muslim American. And he survived. But why am I telling this story? I'm telling the story because I read about it and I was moved by it, and it's something that goes beyond what the law could ever do. So Mark Stroman ended up being taken to trial for one of the other murders that he committed, and convicted and sentenced to death. And at the time that he was sentenced to death, Mr. Bouillon, one of his victims who did not die, decided, after thinking about it and consulting with his faith and thinking about what is good in the world, he didn't want the state to put Mr. Stroman to death. And so the victim of the crime, the person who was left to be dead, decided he was going to spend his time trying to save Stroman from the death penalty. And he did a lot of things, right? He lobbied the Texas Attorney General. He wrote petitions. He wrote letters. And then he did something, as I say in the book, that I could never do. I'm not a good enough person. He forgave the person who tried to kill him at point-blank range. And on the eve of the execution, Mark Anthony Stroman was interviewed by the New York Times by post, by mail, and the perpetrator said he had finally come to understand that hate is a terrible thing. And when asked what he thought about the efforts of Reyes Bouillon, he said, it's impossible, I'm paraphrasing, that he was moved by the fact that this person is trying to save my life when I tried to end his. And then the wheels of justice ground on, and Reyes Bouillon's efforts were not successful, and Mark Anthony Stroman was put to death. And as I write in the book, there's a story there of how sort of the engine of justice and the machinery of justice proceeds and does what the law requires it to do, but much more inspiring to me, beyond what you learn in law school, is that there was this man who decided to be so big and so magnanimous that he decided he would try to save the life of the person who tried to kill him, which is a really rare thing and a really special thing. And one thing I learned very recently is that Mr. Bouillon continues in that vein, is actually become a mentor to one of the surviving children of the person who tried to kill him. And the reason I know that is that I just met him backstage for the first time. And Ray Bouillon is here in the audience today. He's a resident of Seattle, and he's sitting right there. And so for people who think that lawyers do good work, they don't. The people who, I mean, they try to. But I've never been inspired by anyone as much as by this gentleman right here.
So maybe one or two more questions, then we'll take questions from the audience, and it'll be midnight, and we can all go home.
I can go all night.
You're on Eastern time, my friend.
It's like 4 a.m., I think, for me.
So based on what we've heard, based on the example that we just heard about, based on what's happening in our world today, like, not the question I don't want to ask is democracy dead? The question is, what is our way back? What do you see as our way to reclaim the American experiment and to move forward in this country after this moment?
Thanks for that easy question.
Yeah. And we're short on time.
Keep the faith, man. Like, no, I'm going to answer it this way, right? People often ask me the question, what is it like to work in the Southern District of New York? Terrible things are part of your job, right? People in SDNY and any prosecutor's office, but particularly there, are confronted with the worst things that people in America and in the world do. They kill people, they intimidate witnesses, they enslave women, they subjugate children, they fly planes into buildings. I mean, they do things that are just the worst things that humanity does, and it can bring you down. And people ask me, how do people deal with that? And why would you want to work in such a place? And what I say is, the opposite of that, the other side of that is, there are people who come to work every day, notwithstanding all that evil and all that terrible stuff and violence and pain and suffering and crying and dealing with victims, who come to work because they want to do something about that. And they want to make the world better. And they want to light a candle against all those terrible things that bring darkness. And so even in a place that's so terrible and awful, where genuinely disgusting things happen all the time, it's an incredibly idealistic place because you have good people who are responding to bad things, which is, to me, an analog of what I think America needs to do in response to the question you're asking. Child separations at the border, people marched in the streets, right? Terrible things happening with the Muslim ban, people marched on the airports and marched in the streets. And so people have to remember that it's their country, and if you make a big enough stink about something, there are very few things that the current president has withdrawn, but there are things that he has. And you know when it's happened? It's happened when lots and lots of people stand up about it, talk about it, call their senators, run for office. You know, there's been a lot of advancement on the issue of gun regulation at the state level, not the federal level, but the state level, because grassroots people, including my good friend Shannon Watts, who some of you may know from Mom's Demand, have taken some action. So speak up, don't get exhausted, don't get tired, and whoever you are, you can make a difference.
You are making a big difference for this country. And I will tell you how, regardless of ideology, having someone speaking rationally, civilly, as an adult in this political climate is endlessly refreshing. So thank you so much for that. Thank you. So returning to the personal, and we'll go to audience questions. What is next for you?
Sleep.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. You were born in India.
Yes.
Came to this country. You cannot run for president or presumably vice president. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So what are you running for?
My supper. Look, you're asking the question I get asked a bunch. So I love public service. Look, I was in public service for 17 years. I decided to remain in public service at the request of a president that I didn't vote for and that I didn't believe in, because I felt that I had an independent position and I could continue to do some good there at a salary that was a fraction of what all of my friends from law school were making. So I am profoundly interested in public service, but I don't have any plans to join politics in the same way that I don't have any plans to join the circus. Mm-hmm. And I mean no offense to the circus.
Very good. Very good.
But that said, I don't want. I make sure you understand. I'm not insulted. I deeply respect. It's important. I deeply respect politics. I worked for the United States Senior Senator from New York for 4.5 years. I follow politics carefully. I think that the path to making America better is through people like you, who have the guts and the stamina and the energy to do a very, very difficult thing, which is to run for office and to figure out how to do those things and to have a steel stomach and a thick skin to take all the nonsense and crap. I'm a little bit weaker than you. And so I don't have that stamina at this moment. Maybe I'll have it in the future. But when I say I'm not interested in running for office, I don't mean any disrespect to people who do. In fact, I want and hope that more good people like yourself run for office.
All of you. All of you. I think, do we have time? Weir, will you keep the doors open? Do we have time for some audience questions? Wonderful.
One. Make it good.
So we have about 10 minutes for questions. We do ask that folks use these microphones on either side of the stage so that we pick you up for our recording and also for our assistive listening system. We will go back and forth between the microphones, and if you ask quick questions and keep them in the form of a question, we can get through probably a few of them. So.
Hello. So I was reading an article today about the Louisiana, I believe it was New Orleans, prosecutor's office, who was issuing fake subpoenas to people that weren't signed by judges. And they just found out about it. And they're arguing in federal court that prosecutors have absolute immunity against civil lawsuits. How would you respond to that? And how do you feel we could fight what I would say is crap?
So I don't know anything about that. I don't know the particular facts or circumstances. I think like in every area of professional life, whether you're a doctor or a lawyer or a prosecutor or anyone else, if you have violated your oath or you've done something bad, you should be held accountable. And if a particular threshold of evidence has been reached, you should be liable to pay. And if a higher threshold of evidence has been reached, you should be punished criminally. I just don't know the fact. So I am in favor of accountability on the part of prosecutors, state or federal or otherwise. I just don't know the facts of that case.
Yeah, there can't be a philosophical justification for absolute immunity for anything, for misdeeds.
No, look, that's the argument that the president has been
No,
making.
this is his main argument.
He's like, no, we can do whatever we want, and there's absolute immunity. But anyway, talk about that.
Right. Over here.
I want to get some questions.
Thank you. Trump is not the only person who is in the news today. I was also reading a lot about Bill Barr.
Yeah.
Apparently, he now is saying that all attorneys general have to go through him first if they have something sensitive that he might like to review. And also, apparently, he quashed a number of investigations that were starting to come to forefront from Mueller's report. I'd love your comments.
So I don't know about the second part. I hadn't heard that. What I have heard, it's a good question, that apparently there's some guidance that's gone out to the Justice Department saying that before you're able to pursue investigations of the president, the vice president, I think other high-level elected officials, you have to get the express written consent of Major League Baseball and Bill Barr. So in an ordinary universe, I'm going to say something maybe will surprise people. In an ordinary universe, it is not a crazy thing, right? And I did a lot of sensitive public corruption investigations. I investigated we investigated the mayor of New York City, the governor of New York State, the Speaker of the Assembly, the Senate Majority Leader. 2 of those 4 we charged and convicted and went to prison. It's sensitive. And in an ordinary universe, you would want there to be high-level, good faith, independent review to guard against some bad actor, rogue prosecutor who's doing things for bad reasons. The funny thing is, though, that based on everything we sort of know, it seems that the good faith actors are the line-level prosecutors, and the people to be concerned about are the ones at the top, like Bill Barr. And so as a general matter, it's not crazy for that to be in place. Given the track record and given the kinds of things that I think Bill Barr has done, who I initially was hopeful would be actually a very good attorney general, and I withdraw that optimism, and the way he's protected the president, I think it's cause for alarm. So yes, I share your concern.
Thank you so much for being here. I'll be honest, I haven't read your book yet, but I will.
But you will.
Yeah, I got my copy tonight.
Okay.
What was your most memorable case through your career?
So that's hard because I had a lot. I'll mention. So I don't want to ruin the surprise for. So there's a case that I talked about in the book. I'm trying to think how to talk about it without ruining it for those of you who are really excited not to have anything ruined. There was a case where people came to my office and they talked about a New York City police officer who we were considering arresting because there was evidence that his wife found because she thought he was cheating on her, and so she put spyware on his computer, and then she went and checked the spyware, and she was, I guess, gratified to see that he wasn't cheating on her, but then not gratified to see that he was visiting all these very, very, very disturbing websites on which he was discussing with great particularity cannibalism. See, I knew it. Like, I don't want to end the evening. You saw that I paused before I... But that's some memorable stuff, right? And he became known... It's a very complicated story. You should read the chapter before you have a meal. He became known as in the tabloids in New York, he became known as the cannibal cop. But it's a very interesting story because the question is, did he really intend to do it? So it's memorable because it's macabre, but did he mean to do it? Or was he one of these people, and I don't know if you know this, there's lots of like fantasy cannibal people on the internet. I don't see more than 2 or 3 of you here tonight. based on my training and experience. But at least one is in the front. And the question became, the fascinating legal question became, was it a fantasy and a thought crime, or did he really mean to do it? And I'll let you read the story to see what happened at the trial, but that's about as memorable as it gets, yes.
We have time for a few more, if we can
I
keep it
can't
quick.
top that.
Go ahead.
Could you comment on some recent behavior of elected officials who are trying to stifle First Amendment rights, such as Ranking Member Nunes filing defamation lawsuits?
I'm sorry, the last part, who?
Ranking Member Nunes filing defamation lawsuits against American citizens.
So I'm not a fan of Devin Nunes.
There you go.
I don't even have to answer substantively. I can just be like, here's some red meat. Look, you know, isn't there someone here who has had a suit filed against him by Devin Nunes? Does that person want to make himself known? Seriously? Okay, never mind. Yeah, look, I haven't looked at the actual, drafting of the suits. I think they're silly. I think they're ridiculous. On a personal note, again, not a substantive answer. I try to be. Dow is very kind to say that I'm usually measured and rational. I'm a human being, and I get worked up too. There have been a couple of times when I've gotten worked up on my social media Twitter account. One of which was, there was one Friday night where I think I tweeted about Devin Nunes like 11 times. And that night, like at 12 or 1 a.m., my dad texts me and he's like, "You need to stop that." It was only one of 2 times my dad actually censored me on Twitter, and one of the times was with respect to Devin Nunes.
So what do you think the proper role of lawyers is in the field of medicine? Because you talk a lot about justice, and in certain fields like involuntary psychiatric medicine, my experience with lawyers is wanting to get people out before they should be out. And when we're constantly kind of at odds where, they don't particularly care about the psychiatric conditions because they get them out. In some cases, they'll commit suicide, and we want them to stay. And so, I don't know if it has to be antagonistic, but my limited exposure to healthcare and surgeons is to go to hell with lawyers. That's how to. So.
I'm going to pass that question to Dow.
Yeah. Thank you.
That's a very specific question, a little bit out of my wheelhouse. What do you think?
The law does not work perfectly for the actual human condition, whether it's psychiatric commitment or whether it's simply criminal defense. I'm in charge of all the criminal defense for the county. We're constantly trying to get people out of custody, even if they are a danger to themselves and potentially others. I mean, that's just part of how the law works. And I have to say it's a constant frustration, but we have not come up with a more perfect system yet to both respect people's rights and protect their well-being and the well-being of others.
Yeah, what he said.
Yeah.
I don't suppose you'd care to identify who you support among the Democratic presidential candidates for 2020? But regardless of that...
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. What?
Regardless of that, in a burst of optimism that it won't be Trump and Barr in 2021, what do you think is the most important legal issue facing the next president?
Well, look at that. I think look, for me, and this may be my parochial interest, it's restoration of faith and confidence in the rule of law. I mean, you have a president and the people around him who attack the FBI, attack the intelligence community. It'd be one thing if they just did it sort of all the time, but it's always based on what his personal interest is. And that has caused such a breach of faith in people's thinking about those law enforcement agencies that I think that's an incredibly huge problem. Like, I was involved in a small way, as I described to you guys, where the president breached all these protocols and was calling me directly. And the examples of him telling Jim Comey, could you lay off this guy, Michael Flynn? And he kept saying publicly, could Jeff Sessions unrecuse himself? Like, all of that is the tip of the iceberg. I think you need to have, whoever the next president is, needs to make it very clear that law enforcement and politics are separate. Law enforcement is independent. And I'll say a thing that I don't mean this to sound overly political, but so the current president of the United States has a certain view of what his Justice Department is for. It's there to protect him, and it's there to go after his opponents. But long before there was ever any Donald Trump, Barack Obama was the president of the United States. And I'll never forget, and I didn't appreciate the meaning of this and how special this was until recently. We had a photo opportunity, so all the U.S. attorneys got together in Washington, D.C., like once every 18 months or so. And one of those times, someone thought, wouldn't it be nice to have a photo with the President of the United States? So there's 93 of us in the country, and we take like these two buses. We have a lot of subpoena power, but we took these two buses. There's an extra bus for the subpoenas. And we went to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue and went to the White House. And we all stood on these platforms to get a stage like this to get our picture taken. And the president comes, Barack Obama comes, and he says a thing that seems kind of quaint now. He literally said to us, thanks for your service. And he said, I appointed all of you, or most of us, almost all of us, but you don't work for me. You don't answer to me. You answer to your community, you answer to the public, you answer to your oath. And that's all I want you to do. And I remember thinking that was nice and great, but it was only later that I thought how moved I should have been by that, because that's a norm and a tradition and a sentiment that can vanish like that, and it has.
Yeah.
We need to go back to that.
Thank you. Just have these three. Go ahead.
Full disclosure, I'm a reporter with Como News Radio here in Seattle. I had the pleasure of interviewing you 2 years ago, and if I'd known then what I knew now, I would have brought you some red wine instead of a cup of coffee. Would have been a much better interview. I'm curious about your thoughts on the use of facial recognition by law enforcement, hearing what you had to say about fingerprints, especially in light of the fact that it's basically unregulated territory right now.
So I don't have a considered view yet. I think it's a really, really, really fraught and interesting issue that I will avoid answering in the following way. I think having worked in the Senate for 4.5 years, and from time to time having had to deal with issues of technology, I realized, boy, our Congress, a lot of smart people, it's late now, right? They don't know shit about technology. I mean, at all. I mean,
well, they're on the Google all the time.
Lindsey Graham, who you may or may not like for recent reasons, he's the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. And he has said, in a bragging kind of way, the following thing. And he's responsible in that committee for legislation that would govern all sorts of things relating to privacy and technology and search warrants and everything else. He's like, I believe this to be true. It's not an exaggeration. I have never sent an email.
Wow.
Which he said, and the reason he said in a bragging kind of way is he's also not capable of being sort of subject to scandal because he's not had emails that could be hacked or exploited. So that is an issue, like so many other issues, on which I very much worry that we don't have, a legislative body that is versed in those issues. And I don't know how we're going to deal with it as well as we might. But is that okay that I avoided your question?
It's late.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we have two more questions. Go ahead.
You just used the words norm, tradition, values, and in the beginning you talked about culture. And that is a very fragile thing. And I feel like we've sort of damaged it in a very deep, significant way.
Yes.
Now the question is, how do you see us rebuilding that short of a generational turnover?
Sort of what?
A generational turnover.
You want to get rid of old people?
Well, that, you didn't hear me say that.
What kind of eugenics shit are you fucking... It's late.
It's very late.
It's very late.
I think they stopped filming a while ago. It's fine.
We should bleep some of that. This is why you don't have wine on stage.
I just said one generation.
No, look. My proper answer to that is sort of the same as the other things, right? You just have to have people who come back and want to restore things. One of the things that I'm proud of that I'm doing, in addition to some other stuff that you may know about, is I'm a co-chair of a task force out of the Brennan Center at NYU Law School, bipartisan task force, along with former governor of New Jersey, Chrissy Todd Whitman, Republican governor. She was also the EPA administrator for George W. Bush, on democracy. And our central purpose, we put out 2 reports that we sent to Congress and publicized otherwise on this very question of, in light of all these norms being trampled, what are the things that we should actually solidify into law that would make the country better? And so there's a few things. There's things like the nepotism rules, right? These norms, you don't hire your daughter and your son-in-law to do stuff like minor little things like Israel. There's a loophole there, right? So, John Kennedy appointed his brother. It's crazy. He appointed his brother, and everyone talks about that. But then they passed a law, even though he's a pretty good attorney general. He's one of my heroes. They passed a law saying you can't do that. So there's some things that norms are not enough, and you pass laws. Some things relating to, I think, divestment of property and businesses, etc. But there's some things that you can't actually legislate. People ask me the question all the time. Well, the president can't be trusted with national security secrets. We should take away his security clearance. God bless you, I agree. But he's the president of the United States. He's the commander-in-chief. And he was elected, whether you like it or not. And in no universe can you take away the security clearance of the president of the United States. If anyone in this room, you or I or Dow or anyone, did what the president has done or had the background that the president has with all the craziness, you would never get a security clearance. But you're not the president. So there's some things where we can legislate and make sure that the next president is not going to do these terrible things, and that might include the emoluments clause and all sorts of other things. But there's some things that require Americans to make a better decision about who they elect.
Over here, Preet. Hi there.
I think you're the last. Are you the last? Is he the last one?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
I want you to know I read your book cover to cover, and I have it in hardcover.
God bless you, my child.
I noticed it had red, white, and blue. My question is really around, when I read the book, I'm inspired by the fact that you always spoke about being principled, and you kind of alluded to that right at the beginning of this talk here. And people ask you a lot, and you speak a lot about your career and having principles and how you were a prosecutor. What are some of the experiences earlier in your life, people, events, experiences that made you feel like that was a life worth living, or that was the way you should approach your job, your life, and your career?
So it probably is my dad. So I don't think you learn to respect and like and follow principle, late in life. Maybe you do late in life if you have misbehaved and then recover from that. My dad, who I've mentioned before in a more humorous way, who wanted me to become a doctor, is the most principled person that I know. And what I didn't mention earlier when I said that he wanted to leave India to become an American and bring his family to America was one of the things he was concerned about was even in the hospital where he worked, and this was more endemic, I think, in the 1960s in India than hopefully it is now, was there was a certain level of corruption. There was a certain level of people being promoted because they had inside track and not on merit, and my dad couldn't stand for that. And he didn't like being in a society where he was, and I'm not tagging the whole place with this, but where he was, he thought that there were barriers to success because there was corruption around him. And that's why he left, on top of which he thought maybe we'd have a better life in America. I don't think he would have left, though, without feeling that there was corruption around him. And I feel like when I was growing up with my brother, there was a lot of discussion about that and about doing what's right. And he's not a lawyer, and he's not a philosopher. He was just a good parent and a good dad and a good person on top of being a good doctor, and you can't help but learn the lesson of that. So that on top of the education that I got and what I studied, I think drove me towards this pursuit.
So, Seattle, King County, please join me in thanking the former U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, son of immigrants, and as a child raised in New Jersey, rabid fan of Bruce Springsteen.
That's correct.
Preet Bharara.
Thank you so much.
All I want to say